video will be a demonstration covering how to knit a swatch, a basic stocking stitch swatch, and how to measure your gauge. Hello and welcome to the Crimson Stitchery, a video channel about making all things beautiful and useful. I'm excited about doing this demonstration video for you today, and just before we get started, let's make a cup of tea. Today I'm going for the yummy and fragrant Assam House Blend tea by Bird & Blend, which is their take on a fragrant Earl Grey. I really like strong black teas, and this citrusy floral flavour is such a lift. Thank you, Bird & Blend. I'll put a link to their website in the YouTube description box. In this video, I'm going to be creating a swatch using a new to me yarn. I was very kindly sent this Chunky Roving Retreat by West Yorkshire Spinners in this lovely light grey colour Harmony. This is a yarn that I'm really excited about. It's really soft and it looks lovely, and it's been a little while since I've worked with this type of single ply chunky yarn. So I'm excited to be knitting a swatch in order to just discover a little bit more about the yarn and also discover what my tension is. I'm going to be creating a very basic kind of stocking stitch swatch, and it's knit flat, and it's got a garter stitch edging all the way around the piece. So creating this swatch is going to allow me to create a nice big piece of fabric so that I can get an idea of the drape and the handle, practice working with this new yarn, and also figure out what my tension is and how that compares to what's on the ball band. If we check out the ball band, there are 140 meters per 100 gram ball, and they suggest that you use 6.5mm needles, which is a US 10.5, for a gauge of 14 stitches and 19 rows. So it's really nice and chunky, and I'm hoping that it will really knit up into this lovely thick fabric. So thank you so much to West Yorkshire Spinners for providing me with this yarn. And the needles that I'm using are 6.5mm. I'm going to be knitting the swatch flat, but I am using a circular needle, as you can see here. I tend to prefer to use circular needles, and circular needles are the types that I buy nowadays because, in my opinion, they're very, very flexible and versatile. You can use them for multiple purposes, including knitting flat as well as in the round, large circumferences as well as small ones. So you just get a lot of bang for your buck, as they say, from a circular needle. Let's get started. So firstly, I want to create a swatch that is bigger than 4 inches, and I tend to go for a 6-inch swatch. So I've got 14 stitches. That means I want to cast on half as much again. So that would take me up to 21 stitches. And then I want to add a garter stitch border of 6 stitches, which takes me up to 27 stitches. So I'm just going to go ahead and cast on 30, just to round it up a little bit more. It's okay if my swatch ends up a little bit bigger. I'd rather it be larger than smaller. So casting on 30 stitches. It doesn't really matter what kind of cast on you use here. I'm going for a basic long tail cast on. If you wanted to practice a brand new cast on, then it's definitely a good opportunity to do that now whilst you're doing a swatch. So that's my 30 stitches cast onto my needle, and I've got a little bit of yarn left over. You could just cut that off. What I tend to do is just tie a little knot in that tail just to mark off that it is definitely the yarn tail and not the working yarn, so that I don't accidentally grab that when I'm knitting. So now I'm ready to start, and I'm going to create a garter stitch edging so that my stocking stitch swatch ends up being nice and flat. So I'm just going to knit a couple of rows of garter stitch, and I'm doing that by knitting every row for about 4 rows. Now that I've created a small garter stitch border, I'm going to begin working in stocking stitch, which means that I'm going to knit across on the right side, and then when I turn the piece, I'm going to purl all the way back. However, I do want to leave 3 stitches at each end in garter stitch, so I'll make sure to always knit the first 3 and the last 3 stitches of each row. So swapping to stocking stitch, the first row is the same, just knit all the way across. Now I've turned and I'm looking at the wrong side, so I'm going to knit the first 3 stitches. Now I'm going to bring my yarn to the front and I'm going to purl across. And now I've reached the last 3 stitches on my needle and I'm going to knit those last 3 stitches. Okay, and you can see just the first little bit of stocking stitch there above the garter stitch border. So now I have set up for my swatch really nicely. And the next thing I'm going to do is actually record the needle size that I'm using in this swatch. This is something that I really like to do. I didn't make it up. And I learned to do this through a book called Little Red in the City, published by Isolde Teague. So thank you very much for that idea, Isolde. Now, the reason that I'm going to record my needle size in the swatch is just so that I can see by a very, very quick grab what needle I use to create it. Although I must stress that this isn't a foolproof method because firstly, your tension might change over time. So I might create a certain swatch with a certain stitch gauge using 6.5 millimeters now, but in the future, if something happens, my tension becomes more relaxed or tighter, I might not end up with the same results. Also, it's important to remember exactly what needles you used. So at the moment, I'm using these very, very slick and slippery metal needles, which are higher sharps. And that's what I tend to use now. Although in the past, I would knit with wooden or bamboo needles, completely different materials that yield different results, different tension. So whilst I'm recording the needle size in the swatch, this is a reference that is situated in time. And it's important when you're taking your project notes, if you have a little knitting notebook, or if you save your project notes digitally, maybe in a spreadsheet, maybe on something like Ravelry or another organization app, you know, as well as noting your needle size, note the needle brand and the needle material when you're recording your tension. So now that I've explained that, how shall I do it? So the way that you record your tension is by using a coded system of yarn overs and purls. That's something that I did on this older swatch, where you can see I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 yarn overs there, and then next door I've got 2 purl bumps. So the yarn overs tell you the main number of your knitting needle size, and this is in European sizes in millimeters, right? So 4 holes means that the needle size was 4 millimeters. Next, I've got the 2 purl bumps. Every purl bump represents a quarter of a millimeter. So 2 purl bumps means 2 quarters, which adds up to 1/2, and therefore the needle that I used to create this swatch was 4.5 millimeter needles. And if you're wondering why the purl bumps represent quarters of a millimeter rather than halves of a millimeter, it's because when you get down to the really small needle sizes, from 3.25 millimeter and below, the needles start going down in denominations of 1/4. So it really adds up when you go to the chunkier, larger sizes, but it just makes much more sense when you have the smaller ones. So just to reiterate, every yarn over represents the main whole number of a needle size when measured in millimeters, and every purl bump represents a quarter of a millimeter. And because you're using these yarn overs, that's an increase, and you're going to have to knit a decrease, so knit 2 together right next door to each yarn over, so that overall your stitch count stays the same. So if I go back to the new swatch that I'm creating, my needle size is 6.5 millimeters, which means that I'm going to create 6 yarn overs paired with 6 knit 2 togethers, and then 2 purl bumps at the end to represent the 1/2 a millimeter. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'll knit my first 3 in my border, and then I'm going to knit 1 more just to take me a little bit further away from the border. And I'm going to do my first yarn over. So you saw that I just went round the needle, yarn over, knit 2 together immediately. So you've increased 1 with the yarn over, and then you negate that increase straight away by doing the knit 2 together. So that was my first yarn over, knit 2 together, yarn over, knit 2 together. So you can see on the just underneath the needle, the yarn over holes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I've just ended with my knit 2 together, and I'm going to do purl 1, knit, just to keep a small separation between the purl bumps so that you really notice them and that they don't run together and make it a bit easier to count. And I'll purl my second bump, and that's it. Keep knitting to the end. And now I'm going to turn and do my wrong side row. So I'm going to knit the first 3, keeping that in garter stitch. And now I'm going to purl all the way across to the end. And I'm just going to purl across my yarn overs as normal, as if they were normal stitches. And then knit the last 3 stitches, keeping it in garter stitch. All right, so that's my swatch all set up. Now I'm just going to keep going in stocking stitch until my swatch is square. So knitting all the way across on the right side, and then on the wrong side, keeping the first 3 and the last 3 stitches in garter stitch. The reason that I like to do that is not only so that the swatch can be measured flat really easily, so that the piece doesn't curl, but also because the edge stitches of a piece of knitting can sometimes be a little bit wonky, the tension can sometimes be a little bit dodgy, so it's really nice to just keep the actual main portion of the swatch really nice and neat and tidy. So I'm back from knitting my swatch, and it's more or less a square, so I think I have knitted it large enough, and what I did to check the size was simply just lift up one corner and hold it up to the top there, just so that I know it's roughly square and it's big enough. And there might be a few of you thinking that casting on 30 stitches was way too much, but I'm actually really pleased that I've knitted such a large swatch. And the more I knit, the happier I was, because I learnt so much about the yarn just from that experience. And it's just nice to have this big, robust swatch. So just before I finish off the swatch, I'm just going to talk about what I've learnt by actually knitting it. Firstly, I do really like this yarn. It's really nice and soft and fuzzy, and the fabric that it knitted up into has a really nice subtle halo. I'm not sure if it's going to pick up on camera, but it's got a really nice fuzzy texture, kind of like when you have a cashmere jumper, that kind of idea, which I really enjoy. Because this is a single ply, there's a very slight thick and thin texture. So the surface of my knitting isn't completely uniform and flat, but actually it's got quite a nice lively texture of its own. While I was actually knitting, I discovered that because it's a single ply and I'm using quite sharp metal needles, I actually had to be quite careful that the points of the needle didn't go into the yarn and split it. So I had to adjust my technique accordingly. And I actually wondered if using a blunter needle or a different texture like wood might have been better for this particular yarn. In my case, I don't have the right size wooden needles, and I'm going to have to stick with what I've got. In an ideal world, I guess I might go out and acquire a different type of needle to try out if that was a possibility. But in this case, I'm going to have to adjust my tension. And on the note of tension, in this swatch, you can really clearly differentiate the knit rows and the purl rows. And I think that my purl tension might have been a little bit looser than my knit tension. You can see that because every other row kind of just stands out through this swatch. Again, I'm not sure if it's coming across on camera, but you can see it really clearly by eye. Maybe if I tilt it in the shadow slightly, you can sort of see those stripes going down, and that's what I mean. Those stripes that are kind of catching the light, catching the shadow, that's a difference in tension. And that's really interesting. You know, this might be something that settles down. It's definitely going to settle down when I block the swatch, and I'll get into blocking in a moment. But also it just goes to show that the slight differences in tension that are very normal for many knitters between the knitting stitch and the purling stitch are really quite evident in this yarn. So this yarn might look really good if it was knitted in the round, because every stitch would be knit, or it might look lovely in garter stitch, as indeed it does on the edging here. So just things to consider when it comes to the projects that I'll be planning with this yarn, of which more anon. And do make sure that you are subscribed to the Crimson Stitchery here on YouTube in order to get updates about new videos, and subscribe to my newsletter as well to be the first to find out about brand new patterns and developments. Links are below. So now I'm just going to knit the last little bit of garter stitch edging and then cast off. Let me get on with that now. And just to save a little bit of time, I'm just casting off knitwise while I am actually on the wrong side of the fabric. And what that's doing is transferring the little bump onto the right side so that it creates a little line of garter stitch. That's just saving me a row or so's worth of knitting. And as you cast off your swatch, it's common to become quite excited and eager, but just make sure that your tension doesn't get too tight here. You know, make sure that you're not yanking too hard. And I'm just doing a very basic knitted cast off. Okay, I've cast off my swatch and I'll put my needles and yarn aside. So you can see it's just come off the needles and it's got its own character. And what I will be doing is blocking this swatch. And it's really important to treat all swatches just like you would do your finished items. So if you're going to be blocking your finished item, whether that's steaming or wet blocking by soaking it in the sink, you've got to do that to your swatch as well. And that's because blocking can transform some yarns in many ways. I demonstrated this in another video tutorial series called Knitting with Holst Super Soft. There's a link on screen now if you haven't seen that already. Now, before I block my swatch, I'm going to be taking some measurements so that I can make a comparison before blocking and after blocking. So I've got my tape measure, my pencil, and I've got my notebook here as well. And just a quick note about measuring. I tend to use a flexible tape measure that I prefer to using a hard ruler. That's my preference. But it is important to measure your swatch on a hard surface, whether that is a tabletop like I've got here or on the floor or wherever. Don't do it on your lap and don't do it on, you know, the arm of a couch or a cushion. And the reason for that is you need a firm surface so that you can just press your tape measure down onto the surface of the knitting and the stitches won't become too distorted. If you are measuring a swatch on your knee, it's very easy to actually stretch the swatch just very, very slightly, you know, round the soft surface. It will stretch out and become slightly distorted, which is going to affect your measurements. The other thing to try and do is just keep an open mind when you're measuring, especially when we are swatching to check our gauge for a very specific project. We can sometimes tend to have some wishful thinking when it comes to the measuring and sort of just casually round up or round down a stitch or half a stitch or even a quarter, and that can end up making a really, really big difference when it comes to your finished project. So just keep an open mind and honestly write down the real number that you see. So I'm going to measure across 10 centimeters because I'm going to keep in the metric system. And I'm taking the measurement here from right in the middle of the swatch, and I'm going to be taking 3 measurements, writing them all down and then taking an average. So let's do that. And I'm measuring in slightly different places each time, just making sure that my tape measure is definitely going all the way across the row. And then I'll do the same thing with the length, again measuring 3 times across. So if I look at my 3 measurements, they're actually a little bit all over the place with this swatch. My 3 measurements of stitches were 14.5, 15 and 14.75. And for rows, they were 19.5, 20 and 19. So if I take an average of this, I've got 14.75 stitches per 10 centimeters. And I've got 19.5 rows per 10 centimeters. And I'm going to round up to the closest half. So I'm going to call it 15 stitches and 19.5 rows. The reason that I'm going with a half measurement is because this yarn is pretty chunky, and in this case, half of a stitch is actually quite a significant measurement. It's not negligible. So if I take the ball band back again, The recommended tension was 14 stitches and 19 rows, and I've got 15 stitches and 19.5 rows. So that means that my swatch is knit at a very slightly tighter tension than what was recommended on the ball band. This is pretty much par for the course for me when using this type of needle, this brand of needle, Higher Sharps. I tend to have a slightly tighter tension, and I think that that's probably down to the fact that the needle material is very slick and slippery, and so probably I'm, yanking a little bit harder and the yarn is kind of gliding a little bit more tightly off the needle. So my swatch is slightly tighter than the recommended tension, and I'm going to be blocking it and making another comparison, checking the tension and see if it's changed after blocking. But just off the bat, I'll just feel up the swatch a little bit, and I actually really like it. I might have thought that I wanted to knit this yarn at a slightly tighter tension, but I think given the fact that it's very fuzzy and slightly loosely spun single ply, actually it being very slightly tighter is a really good thing, because it's just bringing the fabric together a little bit more. And also it's not without drape, it's not like just standing up on its own. It's hanging round, I think it's hanging around the hand really nicely, and it's quite robust. It doesn't feel too tight. But in case you're wondering about how to deal with the fact that I've got tighter tension, in order to loosen up the tension, I could do another swatch in a larger needle. Or if that doesn't work, I could also try re-swatching with a different needle material. As I mentioned, I tend to get tighter tension using metal needles and looser tension using wood or bamboo. That's what happens to me personally, but it might be different for you. So this is just another reason why swatching is just such a great activity to work into your knitting practice. Okay, I'm going to be blocking my swatch now, and I've decided to wet block my swatch because I think that since the surface of this knitted fabric reflected the slight changes in tension so clearly, having a really good robust soak and a block will really help it to settle down in that sense. In some other instances, I might just spritz it with water and let it dry, but in this case, let's soak it in water with a little bit of soap for about 15 minutes. After that, I will carefully squeeze out any excess water in a towel. Then I'll pin out the swatch, keeping it nice and flat on top of another towel, and leave it to dry. Now I've come back to the swatch and it's dry, so I'll take the towel away and I'll get ready to measure the swatch again. Straight away, just by looking at it, I can see that the tension has settled down pretty nicely. So the rows that stood out before, because they had a slightly looser tension, have just kind of sunk down and it's a little bit flatter and it just looks a little bit more even and uniform overall. I think you'd probably have to be really scrutinizing the piece of fabric, to notice that the tension was slightly uneven. So that's pretty good and a good advertisement for blocking, and just shows that the yarn responds really well to blocking as well. If I pick the swatch up, I can feel the lovely fuzzy texture, and also that the fabric has got a little bit more drape now that it's been blocked, because I think that the fibres have relaxed into the fabric really, really nicely, and it hangs in a kind of beautiful soft way over my hand. Let's measure the swatch again post blocking and discover if there have been any changes in tension. So I'll just get my notebook and pencil out again, and I'm just making a note post blocking, and I put wet blocking as well so that I know the process. And let's measure. So I've taken my 3 measurements from the swatch, and then I've taken an average, and my average stitches were 14 per 10 centimeters and average rows were 20. So we can see that if I compare that to the previous one of 15 and 19.5, my stitches have actually grown slightly through the blocking. So I think they've probably relaxed and spread out a little bit more. And the rows have actually shrunk up slightly because there are more rows per 10 centimeters, which means that as they've spread out horizontally, they've just come up vertically a little bit. If you think about what happens to the knitted fabric, as knitted fabric grows widthwise, it shrinks lengthwise. And I think that that has happened in a very small amount here. And probably the reason why the yarn was susceptible to that is because it is a single ply yarn, so it doesn't have a great deal of twist and it doesn't have a great deal of structure in its own composition. So it's quite malleable in that sense, which tells me that this yarn will be really nice for drapey items, loose fitting things. Those are the kind of projects that will allow the qualities of this yarn to shine, and I wouldn't use this yarn to knit a very tight fitted garment with negative ease. You know, I wouldn't use it for something really tight and clingy that I needed it to hold its shape. But I think it will be really gorgeous for accessories, things like shawls, cozy things, even cozy hats with a little bit of slouch to show off the kind of drapey characteristics of this fabric, especially post blocking. So there you have it. Now you can see why it's really important to measure the swatch pre-blocking and post-blocking too. And I'm ready to move ahead with my lovely knitting projects with this yarn, and I can't wait. If you've enjoyed this video, please do give it a thumbs up here on YouTube and drop me a comment and let me know how you found it. Have you had similar experiences with swatching? Is this something that you enjoy doing, or are you new to knitting? I'd love to find out where you are at in your swatching journey. Don't forget that this video is part of a longer series, and in the next instalment of this series I'll be demonstrating how to create swatches in the round and going into more depth on that side of things. This video is brought to you courtesy of all of my lovely patrons over on Patreon who support this channel with a monthly membership subscription. In exchange for this, patrons receive lots of exclusive benefits like extra content, early access to patterns, and private access to a Discord server for community chatter. It's a really fun place to be, and do head over to patreon.com/thecrimsonstitchery if that's something that interests you. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.